Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Greg Casey. I'm an associate professor in the economics department and a member of this year's lecture committee. It's my pleasure to introduce today's talk by Professor Brian Michael Murphy. Professor Murphy is a media archaeologist and writer whose work cuts across disciplines and genres. His research and teaching interests include theories of race and racialization, visual culture, data preservation, hip-hop and sound studies, digitization, and the way that media technologies represent and reshape human experience. He holds a PhD in comparative studies from The Ohio State University, where he was a presidential fellow. In addition to teaching at Williams, he's a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University and a Fulbright Scholar. Professor Murphy is the author of the recent book, We the Dead: Preserving Data at the End of the World, which won the 2025 Anne Friedberg Innovative Scholarship Award from the Society for Cinema and Media Studies and the 2024 Louis P. Rutnick Book Prize from the New England American Studies Association. In addition, his writings have appeared in the Kenyon Review, Wall Street Journal, Lapham's Quarterly, IGN, McSweeney's Internet Tendency, among other places. Please join me in welcoming Professor Murphy.
Thanks so much. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I'm not supposed to walk in front of that, but I see many familiar faces. It's really, really nice. I'm going to be a little further away for a good part of this than I like to be, but I will come in and reapproach and all that, right? Okay. And they told, if you find me moving a lot and getting very animated, that is Professor Phoebe Cohen's fault. Because I was told, like, it doesn't have to just be standing up there and reading. It can be interactive. So that's where that's coming from. But no, thanks, Phoebe, and the lecture committee for inviting me. And thanks to all of you for coming out. So I want to dedicate this lecture to my students and specifically their capacity to question and wonder and be awestruck and to not know things. Because this project really grew out of me not knowing things and encountering a lot of objects, a lot of things from history that I just simply did not understand and could not make sense of. And those things generated a lot of questions, and it took me on a long journey. So, in that spirit, as a way of digging into this topic of the data complex, I want to start with a question. I also want to start my stopwatch so that I don't lose track of time. Okay. This is the Crypt of Civilization, an underground vault sealed in 1940 at Oglethorpe University in Atlanta, Georgia. Filled with artifacts from contemporary American culture, as well as voluminous, or what they thought was voluminous, amounts of microfilm copies of important books and encyclopedias. The crypt, according to its creators, was supposed to preserve the, quote, accumulated knowledge of humankind up until that point in history. And yet, the Crypt of Civilization contains a tiny fraction of the data on my personal external hard drive, not to mention the untold countless gigabytes of data held on government and corporate servers about me, what media theorists would call my data body. So I've got a bio body, which you see here, and then we all have a data body. The question is, how did this happen? How did Americans collectively and individually develop this data complex of preserving ever increasing amounts of data and at every turn attempting to preserve them more and more permanently? Now, one way to trace the growth of this data complex is to look at a local or small scale experiment or new technology or technique for preserving artifacts. And then look at how that experiment is later popularized or institutionalized. So what I'd like to do is take you through a few of these timelines. We're going to start with something that was small and local, and then we'll move into something at the national level or corporate level. Okay. So the first one, I'll start with the crypt since we're already here. Now, the crypt of civilization wasn't the first attempt to preserve a kind of snapshot of the day through artifacts and preserve books. For about 60 years before this, we had seen time vessels, they were called. They weren't called time capsules yet. That term hadn't been coined. So things like the 1876 Centennial Safe, which again, just contained little small pieces of daily life at the time and was meant to be opened like 100 years later, right? So this concept kind of existed. But the crypt of civilization is considered to really be the first modern time capsule with a targeted opening date of 8113. Okay, so the notion was that they had enough science by this point that they could preserve all these media artifacts and other artifacts permanently. We'll talk more about how that happened. So we had the crypt of civilization, which how many people had heard of the crypt of civilization before 4 minutes ago? Still not very well known, right? And it wasn't super well known in its day. It did get some media coverage. What was much more well known, and here you see some of what Thorwald Jacobs, the creator, called the micro book. So this is supposed to be amazing to you, okay? You have all of these encyclopedias, all their weight, all their paper, all their leather and gold leaf, condensed down into these pretty big canisters full of reels of microfilm, okay? So at the time, this was cutting edge technology in some ways, all right? Now, what was much more well known, which was created around the same time, was the Westinghouse time capsule of Kupoloi, which was deposited at the New York World's Fair of 1939 to 1940. How many people have heard of the Westinghouse time capsule? More? A couple more. I mean, so this was much better known. The World's Fair was widely covered, and in some ways it was a less ambitious project because it wasn't supposed to be the accumulated knowledge of humankind. It was much more of a cross-section, but Westinghouse sort of put the full weight of its scientific and engineering thought behind this to try to make sure that no threat could destroy this record of civilization that was a gift to the people of the future. This one had a target opening date 5,000 years into the future, so the year 6939 was the target opening date, okay? And I could tell you more about how it was engineered and all of that if you're interested in the Q&A, but it was, let's just say it was very involved, okay? Now, these are great, as you can plainly see, but the problem with them is that while they are pretty secure, they are inaccessible, okay? So you have all of this data or knowledge locked inside, and you can't really get to it. You can't really use it, except 5,000 years from now. So what happens soon after this is that this concept of the time capsule, I argue, transforms. And we get what I call open time capsules. Because what's happening in the Cold War? Nobody knows. We got historians in here. What's something that's happening in the 1950s? What's that? Nuclear annihilation is a threat, right? So in response, Herman Naust founds the Iron Mountain Atomic Storage Company and builds a network of vaults underground to secure, and he swears it's bomb-proof. We can talk more about that myth later too, but he swears it's bomb-proof. So this becomes a place where people can store valuables, important records, important data, whether corporate or government records, and sort of, again, is at once an expansion and an institutionalization of what we saw with the crypt and the time capsule, but also was itself a small experiment that then proliferates outwards, and we see more Iron Mountain-like facilities spreading across the country. Sometimes they're an independent company like this, and sometimes it's a bank or insurance company that builds their own vault or warehouse that's securitized, okay? So that's where we start to get the expansion across the country. All right. Everybody still with me? So we went from the 20s roughly into, well, the 30s roughly into the Cold War, okay? Let's jump back again to the 30s. This is a librarian named Thomas Imes working at the Huntington Library and Gardens, which was a pretty new library at the time. Now, the Huntington Library is full of priceless material. And pretty soon after getting this job, Imes found out that they had a bookworm infestation. Bookworms are actual organisms, and they do eat like everything. They eat books, but they can eat like arsenic and keep going. So anyway, so Imes thinks we've got to stop this sooner rather than later, and that's my job. But I'm kind of a new librarian. This is kind of a new library. I know what I'll do. I'll reach out to all these older libraries. Certainly they know what to do. So he reaches out to the Vatican, and libraries in England, and libraries in the Caribbean, and libraries in South America, and libraries everywhere he can, and nobody knows how to get rid of bookworms. They kind of write back and they're like, we try to put things in metal boxes, or we sprinkled pepper on. I mean, it's ridiculous. It becomes absurd. So he tries to figure out what to do, and he talks to some people at Caltech, and long story short, he uses a fumigation chamber or gas chamber, fumigation tank, to fumigate the books, and it works by a vacuum. So the toxic gas penetrates the books and basically makes it toxic for the bookworms to eat, thereby ridding them of the problem. But I encountered this, and I thought, this is very strange. People are putting books in gas chambers? That's kind of weird. Couldn't have been just that guy, or it was probably just that guy. But then I come to find out the National Archives, which was also new in the 1930s in the United States, was paying close attention after he published the results of his experiment in Library Quarterly. Yes, I've read a bunch of Library Quarterlies from the 1930s, and you know what? They're very interesting. Okay, so you might want to get in there and check it out, because they were doing some really cool stuff, these librarians and archivists. So this is a photo from the National Archives where they have their own gas chambers where they would gas everything that came in to the manuscripts division, right, into many of the collections, as a way of preventing infestation, preventing mold, mildew, all this growth. But the science was really new at the time, so they were still kind of figuring it out. Okay. Now, what's also happening at this time, and this is a really key moment in the data complex, and I'm going to move a little bit because I'm getting antsy, okay? What's also happening at this time is librarians and archivists are sounding the alarm that newspapers, that books printed on wood pulp paper, they're finding them deteriorating. They're finding them, you know, the Harry Leidenberg, who works in the reading room of the New York Public Library, is watching this stuff fall in pieces on the ground every day. And they say it's a crisis. Well, why is it a crisis? They say it's a crisis because by the 1930s, the United States government and pretty much all businesses were these huge bureaucracies, and they relied on paper records to function. So if the paper records are deteriorating and we need those to function, then we need to put the paper records on a material that's more durable, right? Because it's no longer rag paper that kind of lasts forever if you treat it right. At the same time in the 1930s, we have this guy named FDR and his New Deal, which is growing the US federal bureaucracy even further. So we're only going to have a bigger explosion of paper records. Okay? So the Carnegie Foundation collaborates with government scientists at the US Bureau of Standards, which is now the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they carry out the first studies that definitively and scientifically establish the causes of deterioration in paper and microfilm records and effective means of preserving them. This is what paves the way for these time capsules where G. Edward Pendray or Thornwell Jacobs can confidently say, we're preserving microfilm for 5,000 years. We're preserving paper for 69 till the year 6939, okay? All right, so that's some of the context. Where does that go? beyond the National Archives, this establishes standards for libraries across the country. So you have to control and filter the air, the temperature, the humidity, all of that needs to be controlled in a very specific way according to these studies if you want to preserve the things in your care. Okay, all right. Now let me just jump ahead a little bit in time. Anybody ever been to the Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia? I have. Oh, yeah, okay, we got a person. Okay, cool. I didn't stay at the resort. I just went there, of course, to tour the underground fallout shelter that was built for Congress underneath it back in the 60s, because that's what I do. I don't go and do the golfing and everything. I just want to go to the sunless, dark underground space that was actually never used, thankfully. So the Greenbrier Resort, again, was a bunker for Congress. This is the 27-ton door made by the Mosler Safe Company in my home state of Ohio. And the idea was that in the event of a nuclear attack, Congress could go there, stand their ground for a few months. They had food and all that stuff and whatever they needed. But they also had telecommunications equipment. They also had a radio TV studio. Why? Because they imagined that they would need to rule the country from under there. And this would be not a democratic country. This would be a country ruled by martial law, rationing of resources, and the like. And they would need to be able to issue decrees wide and far to still control this, what would be a wild place. Of course, eventually the secret comes out. An investigative journalist, those pesky investigative journalists that find out all the government secrets, one of those, Ted Gupp, he goes down there and figures out what's going on, and it's decommissioned in 1992, whereupon we see one of the key features of the data complex play out. The reuse of fortified and securitized spaces, once used to preserve people or protect people, switched over into facilities that protect and secure data. This is now a data center. So when I toured it, you see the tour of where Congress was supposed to sleep and where they're supposed to take their decontamination shower and eat their food, like freeze-dried food or whatever. But you also see the data center and the servers that is built down there, okay? One more example along these lines. This is the Library of Congress National Audiovisual Conservation Center in Culpeper, Virginia, which houses the Library of Congress's collection of film, TV, sound recordings. It started as an installation called Mount Pony, which in the 1960s held in a bunker $4 billion in paper US currency, shrink wrapped. Because the idea was nuclear annihilation is something that Americans were afraid of, but what they were really, really, really afraid of was a nuclear attack that didn't annihilate us. And then we had to figure out how to live after the nuclear attack. So that's what a lot of the fear was about. So they were really planning for like living after the world ended, if that makes sense. And so they thought, well, if a bunch of major cities get attacked, a bunch of currency is going to be destroyed. And if we're going to replenish the economy, we need to have paper currency along with all of these corporate and government records, which will create what they called continuity, right? So you could reestablish your debt accounts and all these things, right? And collect stuff from people that owed you. Okay. So it starts as Mount Pony, stores all this paper currency. Then, surprise, surprise, once we decide we maybe need to do something beyond store a bunch of shrink-wrap currency, it is the securitized structure housing the mainframe computers for the Federal Reserve in the 70s that handled $30 trillion in electronic funds transfers a year, right? So that's where they were kept. Again, we see this move in the data complex. You create a bunker, a bomb-proof, a securitized space, a vault, an underground, whatever. You put something valuable in it, or you create it to protect people, and it becomes a place to protect and preserve data. All right, now this is really, really important, because at this point, you might get the impression that the data complex only exists on Earth. Oh, no, 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 no. The data complex has much greater ambitions than that, my friends. Somebody knows what this is. I guarantee more people know what this is. Yeah, okay. Somebody tell us what this is, please. It's the Voyager Golden Record. Yeah. So back in the 70s, these NASA scientists wanted to send out the Voyager probe. And the Voyager probe is the reason that we have the first sort of close-up detailed photos of the outer planets like Jupiter and Saturn. What was really cool about that project, if you haven't read about it, is that they realized that there was going to be this alignment of the planets where they could send the probe off from Earth. And if they sent it along a specific trajectory, it could sort of partially hit the orbit of a planet and then boost out of it and sort of slingshot the momentum to the next one. And I guess this was only going to happen like once every a lot of years. I don't remember what it was, but they were like, if we're going to do this, we need to do it now. And then on that probe was this record upon which was recorded all kinds of songs from, Louis Armstrong to Bach, along with recordings of different human languages and stories and greetings of peace and seeking connection with whatever other living beings might be out there in the universe, right? We have not heard back yet, as far as I know. Now, years later, in the early 21st century, a really interesting artist named Trevor Paglen created what he called the Last Pictures Project. This did not have the same kind of utopian bent to it. Paglen wanted to figure out what kind of material would be durable in space for literally billions of years. Working with scientists at MIT and some other places, he settled upon a silicon wafer micro-etched with 100 images that sort of tell a story of what has happened here on Earth, okay? And then it has a casing with a kind of star map that harkens back to the Golden Record and all of that. The idea was that this gets attached to a communication satellite, which it was. That gets boosted into outer space. It goes around the Earth. The satellite does its job, but they only have a limited lifetime being functional. And then eventually it would boost out to what is known as the graveyard orbit, and it would sit out there until the sun expands into a red giant and vaporizes the Earth like billions of years from now. So his idea was that this would be the last artifact of human existence. That was kind of the idea. All right. Now you might be saying, this is great, Brian, or you might be saying, this is not great. I don't know what you're saying, but you might be saying, how is this connected to something bigger? Well, I'm kind of sorry to say that, I don't need a slide for that. I was listening to an interview last month that Elon Musk gave on a podcast where he says that by 2029, the most economic place to put AI data centers will be in outer space, he predicts. Okay, so this idea of launching data into space, again, we see it going from a kind of time capsule model to what I call an open time capsule model, where it's securitized, it's preserved, but it remains accessible through the securitization. Okay. Now, after looking at all this, so those are the timelines. Thank you for following me through all that. I know it was a lot of dates and a lot of things. After I saw all this, what did I conclude? A few things. One, there is a data complex in the United States, and it has developed over the course of the past century. And it has two aspects. It's physical, it's external, it's infrastructural, all of these network communications and data centers and bunkers and telephone lines at one point, and then optic fiber. So the data complex is a physical complex. It's also internal and psychological. It's the reason that I save so many things on that external hard drive. It's the reason I print it out and I back it up and I have the online storage, which I'm running out of, but I refuse to pay. I refuse to give Google money for more storage space. I just will not do it. So I will waste my time trying to clear out my inbox of things I don't need because it frustrates me so much. Okay, sorry, I get too much information. Okay, so it's external and it is psychological. We have a complex. The next thing I realized is that we as individuals, our communication, our relationships, our thoughts, our feelings are actually entangled with these digital and networked tools that we use. We are cyborgs in that way. You know, the people that coined the term cyborg didn't see it as like a human with a machine implant. They actually were talking about outer space exploration, and they saw it as a large technological system with humans embedded in it. Okay, so that's kind of the second thing I realized. First, we have a data complex. Second, that we're entangled with it. And then next, I realized that the data complex is very anxious. What do I mean by that? What we see again and again in the data complex is an old format, media format, data format, whatever you call it, like paper. Oh no, it's crumbling, it's breaking down. Let's back it up with something new, something better. Microfilm. But, you know, microfilm hasn't been used for very long in the 1930s. It had been around. Some banks had used it. Some insurance companies had used it. But it's kind of not time-tested. And they're like, well, the scientists at the Bureau of Standards say it will last. They've done simulations of time passing where, you know, and I'm not making this up, they put the microfilm in a jar with sand and they shake it up so many times and say that simulates 200 years of time passing. Or they use again, not making this up, an MIT folding machine, and they fold it back and forth to see how many times it will break. And that, needless to say, this is like later in the 20th century. They're like, yeah, that was all. Accelerated aging studies are not based on anything really scientific. Nevertheless, they put their faith in microfilm, but because there's that supplement of anxiety, they're like, is there something else we could do to back up the microfilm? So that's where you see things like in the Crypt of Civilization, if we go back to the opening, they backed up the paper on microfilm. Then they had films on the same material, cellulose acetate, that they included in the Crypt of Civilization, that they backed up on metal. That's metal film. It was invented by Thomas Kimwood Peters, the archivist of the Crypt of Civilization. It didn't take off. I found that fragment at the Library of Congress in his papers. As far as I know, I don't know there's any metal film anywhere else except in the crypt. Because like I said, it didn't take off. So the anxiety of the data complex is you have a brittle format or something that's decaying or deteriorating, you back it up in something new, and then you back up the new thing in something ancient that is time tested. And that is what I call a backup loop. That's what we get caught in. We don't move to microfilm and stop using paper. We don't go to computers and stop using microfilm. When I went to the Iron Mountain National Data Center in Boyers, Pennsylvania, and I went 220 feet underground, and I wasn't allowed to use my phone or my camera or anything like that, and I had to be accompanied everywhere I went because, like, the black box from United 93 is down there, and a bunch of things they wouldn't tell me about are down there. I went to a lab where I saw paper files being converted into PDFs, of course, but I also saw PDFs being converted to microfilm because digital is not considered a permanent, long-term, reliable storage format by many people, including many states that require certain records to be still held on microfilm. Okay. Just one more quick example of this, because I was talking to, is it Steve? Keith? Sorry, it's Keith. We were just talking briefly. I just met Keith. We were just talking briefly about something he was reading about, which is that Microsoft, Hitachi, a couple other companies are etching data in glass at the like nanoscopic level as another example of this. So just as Trevor Paglen was etching things in silicon wafer, this micro etching is not going anywhere anytime soon. Okay, so that's some of the features of the data complex. Let's get into another aspect of it, another aspect of the anxieties. So we really talked about data. There are social aspects of the data complex, okay? What's happening in society and its internal relations and divisions. One of the things I was trying to understand is how we got here. So what causes the data complex to grow and expand? What I found was that it grows and expands intensely when people think the world is about to end. However they conceive of that, okay? So in the 1930s, it was the Depression, of course. And there were, on the part of these time capsule creators, significant anxieties about race and immigration and what they called race mixing, and generally sentiments that were influenced by the eugenics movement, okay? So if, for instance, we look at the speech that was given by the chairman of the board of the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company at the dedication of the crypt at the World's Fair, this is a segment. Probably the people who opened the capsule in 6939 will have a physical appearance very like our own, except that they should have learned the principle of breeding a better race. They should be, and probably will be, a race of supermen and superwomen, as judged by our standards, but only common men and women as judged by their standards. This will be a healthy world governed by wholesome people. The abnormal will have no place in it. Now, if we go to a copy of the speech, a draft of the speech that I also found in the Westinghouse archives in Pittsburgh, you see some of the language is even more intense. The persons who next see this is the crossed out part. The persons who next see this capsule will be descendants of ours, some 200 generations removed, and unless they have inbred, no one of them will have more than 1 billion billionth of our blood in his veins. Somebody figure this out for 3 generations, in parentheses. And there's more, but I think that's enough, because you still got to hear about Thornwell Jacobs from the Crypt of Civilization. Westinghouse stole the idea from Thornwell Jacobs. He came up with the idea for the Crypt of Civilization in 1936. J. Edward Pendray wrote an article about it, then went to work for Westinghouse, and then came up with the time capsule. So Jacobs, his Crypt of Civilization, again, was supposed to be opened in 8113. And he had seen society kind of fall apart before. He witnessed the aftermath of the Atlanta race riots in 1906. And in the 1930s, he looked ahead and saw another cataclysm. Back then they called the first one the Great War. And he saw another one coming, like a lot of people did. He was concerned about white civilization's fate if the race suicide of a great war happened again, which is what he called it. Now, if the coming war didn't end white civilization, he imagined that the deterioration of the national stock would. So he recorded a message titled "Greetings to the Inhabitants of 8113" and sealed it inside the crypt. Just as Westinghouse chairman A.W. Robertson hopefully imagined white supermen and superwomen would discover the time capsule, Jacobs communicated in no uncertain terms to the people whom he clearly imagined to be his white counterparts in the future. This is the quote. "It is almost a sure bet that, if nothing is done about it, the United States will, in a few centuries, become a nation of quadroons ruled by an upper class of Jewish blood. At present, we are a conglomerate of whites from Northern Europe, brown whites from Southern Europe, yellows from Asia, indigenous reds, blacks from Africa, with our movies, radios, and newspapers either owned or operated by Jews. With the single exception of science, which is progressing magnificently, all the balance of our civilization, morals, politics, literature, painting, sculpture, seem to be retrograding. And as I prophesied 20 years ago, we are face to face with another world war. His rhetoric only grew more intense over the next few years as the war did come. And the rise of the Nazi regime did not bother him so much as it was an expression of a kind of like white racial downfall on a global scale. He editorialized in 1945, quote, "Yellows, blacks, browns, and reds laugh as white nation slashes the throat of white nation and world power slips from the flaccid hands of the Aryan." I could read more of this. You don't want to hear it. I don't want to read it. But suffice it to say that these are instances of the way that anxieties about the end of the world racially conceived inform, intensify, and expand the data complex. And I saw this in many other cases I could tell you about, but let's shift a little bit and we'll sort of move toward my closing because we've got to go back to outer space. All right. Now, let's take this back a little bit. Okay. They were concerned about the brittleness of the media in the early 20th century, racial anxieties. In the Cold War, we already figured out nuclear anxieties. There were also racial anxieties, to be clear, still. And then what about our age? What are we anxious about? We're still anxious about nuclear technology. We're still anxious about race. But what I look at in my book is the way that the digital age coincides with the age where we become very aware of climate change. Okay, and there are various ways that you can respond to that, of course. Some people respond to that by saying, we'll just find another planet to live on after we destroy this one. Some of those people are very powerful. Okay? So now the data complex looks toward outer space, terraforming Mars. There are people arguing that we should, and this is a quote from a Goldman Sachs investment prospectus, pivot off Earth. Oh, that's the prospectus. What do you know? Space, the next investment frontier. This is from 2017. So this is like outdated. We're way beyond this now, but let's start here. They highlight, quote, boundless landscapes of opportunity in realms like space tourism and, of course, satellites, but also on-orbit manufacturing and asteroid mining performed by robots, which is the stated long-term plan of the startup Planetary Resources, which had a lot of investment at the time. The co-founder of Planetary Resources claimed that an asteroid the length of 100 feet could contain as much as $25 to $50 billion worth of platinum. Let me just read a little bit of this. According to the Goldman Sachs report, this is in my book, according to the Goldman Sachs report, mineral-rich asteroids are also rich in water, which can easily be converted into rocket fuel by machinery installed on the surface of the asteroid itself. Such innovations would make possible, quote, orbiting gas stations for refueling spaceships when we pivot off Earth. Okay. Now, again, this was a prospectus. There were a bunch of startups working on things like this, and in some ways, these were niche industries. But several years have passed, and the rise of Tesla, the rise of SpaceX, the rise of XAI has really changed the landscape, as well as the AI arms race, which we find ourselves witnessing, being a part of, whatever you want to call it. Now, in this Elon Musk interview that I referenced before, he gives a little bit more detail about how he plans to build AI data centers in space. He says that at first he would launch them at the rate of 10,000 per year or 1 per hour, with the goal of soon switching to manufacturing and launching them from the moon. So again, the ambitions of the data center, or of the data complex, go way, 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 way beyond Earth. So to conclude, and then we can open up to questions and we can talk about whatever you want to talk about, I'd like to share a little passage from my book. This is my book, We the Dead. Yes, the cover is very creepy. I wanted it to be. I actually took an illustration from the 30s that Westinghouse used to promote the World Fair, and it was of the Middleton family, which was supposed to be the average American family attending the fair. And I sort of like, I got my scissors out and my markers, and I started cutting and like pasting and stuff, and I scanned it, and I sent it to my editor. I was like, I think I know what I want the cover to look like. And he's like, yeah, we have professional illustrators who make our covers, so you can just, that's really nice. But he did actually like draw from the idea, but to be clear, this is night and day better from the thing that I came up with. So anyway, these are this is the daughter, the like file cabinet zombie over there is the daughter, Babs Middleton, and this is the son, Bud Middleton. So anyway, in my book, I have this passage, which is a bit of a provocation, but in any case, it's in there. So let me just, this is in a chapter called Save File as DNA, because one thing that I didn't say much about in this talk, but that is a really key part of this new era of permanent and dense storage, is that there are startups who have figured out how to store digital data in synthetic DNA using the nucleotide bases as a sort of binary code that they can layer. So it promises to be the most dense and permanent storage format because you can like hydrate it or dehydrate it or freeze it, right? Or fossilize it in some way. Okay, so this is my closing and then we'll talk. DNA data storage points toward a significant shift in the data complex, and thus a shift in what it means to be human. Many fear that artificially intelligent systems will supersede human intelligence, or that the robots will rebel against their masters, or that some other similarly Hollywood-esque scenario will play out if we continue to expand the role of machine learning in everyday life. But cyborgs are nothing new. We've long been cyborgs. Besides, the machines have already won, as human biochips are now embedded in the cyborg of the data complex. If life were an early Cold War B movie where extraterrestrial marauders are scanning Earth for life and treasure, can you see them? They always then they beeped and floated around and the graphics are really bad, right? Which organism would the aliens conclude reigned supreme on this planet? Certainly not the humans. For the humans are working feverishly to pull minerals from the ground and refine them, to build data centers and lash them together with fiber optic cables laid across oceans and deserts, to connect all these machines through invisible tethers of light attached to satellites ringing the globe, and to spend most of their waking hours every day staring at screens and feeding data to the data complex. Even when these strange little creatures called humans are not clicking and scrolling, they are carrying devices that perpetually transmit data about their location, the number of steps they take, and their resting heart rate to be recorded in the several million silicon bellies of the supreme beast. Even while they sleep, the data complex grips humans' wrists through smartwatches and counts their heartbeats. Thank you. Yes, Phoebe.
So when you were talking about the fact that a lot of these centers are still using analog, that would about the cycle.
Oh, the backup loop.
Yes, the backup loop. It made me think of the fact that, like, you know, people who work at Facebook don't let their kids use Facebook, or people who, you know, work at Apple don't let their kids have smartphones. And so I'm wondering if you have heard of any evidence of any of these major tech companies going analog with their data archiving or data storage. Their like, are they eschewing their own products for the sake of, like, longevity?
I think, and Jessica is going to be able to jump in here if I get something wrong, which is good. So I'm glad you're here. Some of the laws that were created back in the 30s with the New Deal around regulation and compliance and records retention for corporations, they actually can't, because the scale of the data that they produce, it would be impossible to do it without digital. I think related to backup loops, one thing that is interesting is that there's a lot that is still stored on magnetic tape. So they're like reels you see in like old spy movies, because the aerial surface density is pretty good, and then this tape is so thin that you can store a massive amount of data on a reel. So that's still around, but I would say that they can't really issue their products because they just, for compliance alone.
Yeah, data centers aren't going to be around 50 or 100 years from now unless they have a digital preservationist.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they aren't moving analog, but many of the corporations are hiring actual archivists to work with them and curate.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah.
So this is fascinating, and I think that I haven't actually seen the cover before. I think it's hilarious and terrifying indeed.
Do we need a microphone for people asking questions? Like, can you hear in the back? The people that you can hear?
Okay, I can be louder. I'm a naturally very loud person. So I'm just curious. Some of what you were saying made me think of another setting in which we think about data that is generated and its security and its safety, and there's also a lot of racial anxieties there also, and this is in the context of voting. So I wonder if any of what you have taken in and been thinking about in recent years gives you any insights into how people have been talking about modes of voting and cutting off modes of voting and changing from paper to digital paper, like whatever. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do have some thoughts about that. I guess I'd say a couple of things. There's a lot of so the first thing that I associate to is actually, so I'm from Ohio, so I lived through the 2000 election and the 2004 election there. And so this is kind of a half-baked thought, but one of the things that played out back then was Ohio was switching to electronic voting machines. So the faith that we had in paper and the people counting on paper then had to be transposed onto these digital machines, and it wasn't a smooth process. So I think in short what I'd say is that those moments reveal something about power, right? They reveal something about the way that corporations can maneuver in these moments of media transition. So this is not a very like uplifting answer or illuminating, but I just remember, I'll just tell detail to the story. I remember being amazed that the voting machines were being made by Diebold. Diebold makes ATM machines, right? When people like me, I was a part of an activist group called the League of Pissed Off Voters. When we challenged, the name later got changed to something more marketable, but anyway, when people like us said like, okay, backup loops, right? It's electronic, create a paper printout. That way, if it's hacked or anything like that, we have a paper. You know what they said? We don't have the technology to do a paper printout. This is the company that makes ATMs, which gives you a receipt, right? So it was interesting the way that those stories circulated around, like the stories they told about media technology that effectively allowed them to retain their power, control, and all that. So, and then the other story that I love, there's something I think out of Iowa in the past 10 years where they had some outdated digital system, and they could. Did you hear about? Did anybody else hear about this? Somebody know what I'm talking? What happened there? Jessica's like, you're the co-speaker.
Systems are so outdated.
Yeah.
They have to hire archivists to be able to emulate that.
Right. So that's something we saw recently. It was just how this catches up to us eventually. But yeah, thank you for the question. Here and then here. Christopher.
Can you say something about what you think the impact of thinking about us as data has on conceptions of personhood?
Yeah.
Because there's a long history of us conceiving of ourselves, and especially our brains, based on the most current technology. So we used to be thought of as pneumatic things, and then we were computers. But now increasingly we're being talked about, especially by people in tech, as data.
Yeah.
And one of the things that strikes me there is the data is not embodied in the same way as those earlier models were. Where when I was thought of as a computer, I was still this standalone thing. But now you've had people like Ray Kurzweil and others conceiving of us as simply ones and zeros, and so we can be uploaded eventually. How does that change the way we think of ourselves as in terms of personhood?
Great question. So I'd say two things. One, there is a theorist named Mel Hogan, who's currently based in Canada, who has this concept, and didn't come up with it, but has elaborated it in the best that I've seen, called dataism. So dataism being an ideology where data is the thing of supreme value and the human becomes secondary. There were people before Mel, like the Critical Art Ensemble, that talked about, that's kind of where I got the term data body from. And they said that once data ascends, and they wrote this in like the 90s, once data ascends to this position of supreme value, the human basically becomes the backup for the data in some ways, or they actually put it more strongly, like the counterfeit of the data, which is taken to be the authentic thing. So there's a power dynamic again. Anytime you have to like prove your identity or prove your humanity, right? There's a way in which the robots have already won once you're put in the position of proving yourself to be real. But in terms of the second thing I would say, part of the impact is that the data complex is now fabricating and extracting from new layers of the self. So one of the areas of a lot of movement right now is in pupillometry. So this is eye tracking and tracking pupil dilation. And there's a whole ideology around it that says you can actually read people's emotions and desires that they are not even aware of, right? So there's something to that. There's also layers of it which are, as I said, kind of fabricated. But there's a really brilliant legal scholar named Britton Heller who's writing about what she calls biometric psychography. So what happens is that if we see ourselves as having these layers that we don't even understand, but that the machine understands, and we're simultaneously having conversations with these machines, that goes two ways. It reshapes how we see ourselves in any case. But younger humans, right? The cognitive developmental question of how that shapes somebody who's 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 or 8, and going through those loops, those conversations, those conceptions of the self where you are what Martin Heidegger called a standing reserve. You are just your body is just he was talking about this in relation to genetics, but your body is just a holder for the genetic, basically data that moves through you. You live and die, but this thing lives forever. So the tech world didn't invent these kind of conceptions. This is what animates eugenics. That's why there was a eugenics record office. That's what it was supposed to do. It was supposed to retain the data that pure white bodies carried around and reproduced in their progeny. But the archive was the thing that had to be bomb-proofed and protected. The United States never built a network of shelters to protect all the people. It built a network of shelters to protect all the data. It got that done, right? So hopefully that kind of answers your question, but I don't want to ramble, but we can talk more about it.
Prove yourself already happened in Minneapolis, where people were told their physical identification, the form of their documents, did not match their face scan, and the face scan was what got them arrested.
Yeah. Do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I do. So if I understood the thesis at the heart of this, it's that that fear, anxiety of the end of the world leads to an intensification of the collection of stuff that we're saving about ourselves in ever-enabled ways in the West, perhaps in the United States in the 20th or 21st century. And I guess I'm a historian, so I'm thinking about this a little bit over the long arc of history. But I was thinking a lot about, well, what distinguishes the beginning of your story, the 20s or the 30s, as you told here today, from, say, the library, right? The Alexandria, the sort of, we had the tech to save what we could save, and at the time we thought it was all of human knowledge, and we just understood human knowledge to be a narrower thing. And then, you know, sort of the more you can learn and know, which in some ways tech allows, in a certain way, the more you want to save and preserve it. There seems to be a particular narrative about 20th century catastrophe, nuclear, climate embedded here. And I guess I'm just wondering how particular this story is to the 20th century, or is the 20th century just the complete sort of acceleration of something that actually has been kind of a human save, gather, we are so interested in ourselves that we want, even when we're gone, the thing that comes after us, if something does, to know how important we were.
Yeah. This is a great question. And like a good academic, I'm going to say something like, in the broader project, I answer that. Because all questions are answered in the broader project, as you know. But so part of what's missing from this talk is, let's start with a thing that is similar across time. So there was a film theorist named Andre Bazin who wrote an article called The Ontology of the Photographic Image. And he said that at the heart of the plastic arts, but at the heart of all these things humans do to create representations of themselves and of the world, painting, sculpture, all this, at the heart of that is a mummy complex. So he said that we are anxious about our mortality, all of us. And as a way of sort of battling against that, or sort of trying to outwit time, we create these representations. And so he takes ancient Egyptians and mummification as a paradigmatic example of that. Now, so that was cool when I came across that, right? But then I was like, okay. And I started looking, I'm like, are there other explanations? And like everything I found was like, it was like a History Channel document. It's like, since the beginning of time, man has always preserved. And I'm like, wait a second. What the Egyptians did seems pretty different from when Bill Gates buys the Bettman archive of 11 million photographs, builds a 10,000 square foot freezer in an abandoned limestone mine 200 feet underground and says he can preserve it for 10,000, 15,000 years. I'm like, the Egyptians never did that. Like, so the desire to preserve is, we might even say, universal and transhistorical. But Bazin could never account for why practices and desires for preservation and technologies to preserve intensify where and when they do. So that's what I was trying to do. We know that the intensification happened because we saw these permanent time capsules and this extensive network. So to the second part of your question, I guess, yes, what I was tracing was an intensification to try to account for how and why Americans became the most prolific and intensive preservers of data of all time. Part of it's also related to the 19th century, where the railroad sort of like stretches business units, and then telegraphic communication and the printing of paper records and the moving around those paper records make it impossible for humans to hold in their heads all the stuff that they need to know in order to run their business, right? So that means that the organization of the corporate form and social relations in so many ways became more reliant on the storage of information that would later need to be accessed in a way that, if you go back to like a textile factory in Lowell, prior to the railroad, people would kind of like, I mean, they had paper records, of course, but like it wasn't, there's all stuff about rise of the insurance industry and stuff too, but hopefully that speaks to like what's particular and what's not. Yeah. Here, and then after Mark.
In some ways, I think I might have the geographic or national version of Maud's question, which is there a kind of particularity to an American data complex? And I guess I'm thinking in part about, is there something about a totalizing nature of the desire to acquire and preserve, or the particularities of the Cold War experience, or racial anxieties, or the wealth to be able to build the physical structures to preserve? How much of this is a broader human story and how much of it is it a particularly perhaps American one?
Yeah, so great question. I would say there's those three levels. There's historical and geographic, or what I talk about in the book is geological. So what happens in the first couple decades of the 20th century is the United States becomes more internationally imperial after the Spanish-American War, starts to sort of see themselves as more of an empire on that scale. And part of that is a national archive, following France, following England. And so by the 1930s, on the eve of the New Deal, like, there are millions of government records that are just all over the place, right? They actually do a WPA project just to figure out where everything is, right? So that's part of the archive, National Archive formation being related to like a different sense of America about itself as an empire on the world stage. So that's the historical part. And then the geographical part has in part to do with the intensity psychologically of it, is that one of the things I argue in the book is part of the reason why it's so intense in the United States is that the United States was never bombed, and that the fact that it wasn't bombed actually intensifies the anxiety around the nightmare of it. I mean, Pearl Harbor happened, but Hawaii was an imperial, like, that was not a state yet, right? So this was like a battle over an imperial possibility. But the geographic part also is probably more important and more substantial, is that if you look at the places where the data complex really developed with intensity, it's very much related to the geological formations in that area. So in the mountains, in the geological formations in the glacier that swept across New England that left behind all of the ponds and lakes that the natural ice was cut out of as the sort of one like prehistory of the data complex, because refrigeration was used to preserve so many things. That then sets the stage for some of the same things we see with mountains and bunkers and underground spaces. It's kind of hard to trace all at once, but it's in the book. So New England's geologic past set the stage for some of the things that happen here. You'll see things in West Virginia and Pennsylvania because it's seismically stable. You'll see things in the Pacific Northwest, which is like one of the most carbon-rich biomes on the planet. So that grew all those trees, which then meant when planes were built out of wood still, Boeing put their plants there, which meant that by the time Bill Gates' dad got there, it was already full of technical workers, which means that the computer industry moves there and sets the stage for that. But all that connects back to geological things that happened tens or hundreds of thousands of years over time. Even the Corbis Film Preservation Facility in a former limestone mine in Pennsylvania happens because there used to be 300 million years ago, there was a sea there, and all of that sedimented into limestone. These are the skeletons of coral from back then, right? And that's what they dig into. So hopefully I wasn't too rambling, but there are particularities about the United States that make it a place for this.
As someone who studies Japan, that's really fascinating, because you have a country that becomes an imperial power about the same time, but has experienced atomic bombing.
Yeah.
And is not at all geologically stable. So
Yeah.
it's, anyway, the comparison's interesting.
Thanks. Lara, you had your hand up, right? And then Mark?
So, thank you. This was fascinating. I found myself thinking, as you were talking about this, there is a sense of, in addition to anxiety driving it, there's also a sense of hope, in an odd way, that there will be an after, right? So we have to save things because there's going to be an after. Or we're going to send this gold record out into the nothingness because there's something out there. And so I was sort of curious whether in your book you talk about or think about the choices that people make for what they are preserving and how that might relate to either the anxiety or the hope for after, the sense of what drives society, or what we need, what the after people will need, or is it just so inward looking that there's not that sense of why a particular choice is made about what gets preserved?
This is a great question. So part of the data complex is a constant flickering between the nightmare and the dream, the hope and the fear. So you see it again and again where they would write short stories about what it's going to look like when in 6939 the capsule is opened. And it is either the Superman story, right? Or it's society has degenerated to such a degree that they need the civilizational knowledge to actually get them back on track. Both things are operating at the same time. Part of why that anxiety persists is because if I am Thormel Jacobs or Giabra and I think that as like an Anglo-Saxon European, I am superior, right? Part of why I think that is because of my technology. But if my technology destroys society, necessitating this time capsule, what does that say about my superiority? But then, if my technology doesn't destroy society, it does stay on track, and in 6939, they are indeed supermen and superwomen, they're gonna look back at me as a primitive. So you see them jumping back and forth in their speeches and their letters where they are simultaneously like, we're superior, and that's why we have to save this and do this. And if we succeed, as soon as we imagine success, we see ourselves as ancient and backwards. And so and this just fuels and spins out this whole thing. I thought there was another part of it to your question that maybe I wasn't getting to. Oh, it was with those projects, especially with Westinghouse, it was very, very worried over. If you want some light reading, pick up the book of record of the time capsule of Kupaloy. I'm sure we have a copy because they sent copies to all the important libraries all over the planet and to like shrines and temples in the Himalayas, and like because they wanted to be able to tell the future people how to find it. They couldn't just say go to Flushing, Queens, because as they say in the book of record, they said, what did they say? They said something about there was a rumor that, well, let's not get into that. But the point is, they created the book of record. It had all the instructions about how to find it. It even had a story and a guide for teaching people of the future English. And it was created by John Harrington, who was a very prominent anthropologist, maybe the most prolific one living at the time. So yeah, if you look at the book of record, you'll see they tried to think of literally everything. And then they had these really kind of haunting letters from great men in the back, like Einstein and Thomas Mann and all these people. And some of them were very hopeful, and some of them, like Einstein's, was like, I don't know about the civilization thing. So yeah, they thought a lot about it and debated a lot about it. Yeah. No, Mark, you had your hand up, and then we'll go to the back. And I don't know about time and when I'm supposed to stop, so just somebody who's, yeah.
So this was inspired, it's sort of at the intersection of what your exchange with Christopher and with Maud, and it's at most half-baked, so if I get even a half-baked answer, it's as much as I deserve. But mostly what we do is forget stuff and throw stuff away. Preservation is the exception, even if it goes back forever. And I'm wondering if, in a weird way, the moment we're in now, like thinking of how you talk to Christopher about young people formed in interactions with LLMs, is tipping the balance. Like LLMs suck up all the knowledge we produce and agglomerate it and don't sort it or store it or attribute it. And increasingly, the thing we worry about, if our students get their knowledge from it, they have no idea where it comes from, right? So are we living through potentially, even as I'm no doubt like the DNA encoding stuff you write about is going along, and we're going to get or we can etch it on glass and we can store ever more information in ever smaller spaces? Are we at the same time living for a moment in which we're like on the cusp of a high-tech induced mass forgetting where we don't even know?
Yes. I mean, even going back to like 1980, Pierre Nora, like Lieu de Mémoire, he says like people create archives when there's stuff that they don't mind forgetting, and that they might possibly need, but really that is like that in itself, just that archive and preservation process is this exteriorization. And now it's happening at hyperscale. So yeah, I think that the forgetting, but also going back to Christopher's question, the nature of our relationship to information, our relationship to data, is shifting. I don't have a full prediction of where it's going to be a couple years from now, but there's definitely a distance that's being created, ironically, at the same time. Hand in the back, and then up here, and then are we supposed to stop at like 6:30? Who is here Oh, 5:30, right, okay, cool. Yeah, let's do 2 more, and then we'll, yeah. It's really amazing. Really, thank you.
I think in relation to what Mark, and I think it relates to what Ward is saying, I think when you truly look at the long term, the preservation that takes place is the accidental preservation. These very deliberate preservations last within a certain period. That might be very long. It might be a century or 2 centuries. But ultimately they will fall apart. And what will remain, the archives of the Hittite civilization was lost and then refound. And that's how it will ultimately be preserved.
Yeah, thank you for that. And back to your question too, World War I played a huge role in stimulating in the 1920s, like the idea that, Paul Valery wrote about it, but people in the United States were thinking like, oh, this can all get destroyed. Like it can all really get destroyed, so maybe we should do something. And then maybe this should be the last one. So.
I wanted to say, I see that LLM project as a very political project of what gets remembered, because that's part of the task of creating the LLM is to choose what knowledge you are encoding in there. And that's a choice. And it's a choice that's going to exclude as well as to include. That this is part of the thing that we're in the middle of.
Right.
But I think also this week, Amazon lost 2 data centers. I don't know if you know that. It was not really in the news. Okay. They have a reliability thing where a region consists of at least 3 data centers, and if they lose one because there's a power or a flood, then they have backups in the other 2. Right. They lost 2 in the same region, not through floods, right? Yeah. Through missiles. Wow. Not well reported, but that has, I think, got a lot of the tech industry in newly wondering about data integrity and kind of retention and so on. So I think it's super timely discussions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think there's some snacks after this, right? Thanks so much.